I came home from my shift at the campus library to find my entire collection of first edition novels sitting in a dumpster behind our house in Willowbrook. 23 books I'd spent 4 years collecting, some worth hundreds of dollars, all soaked in yesterday's coffee grounds and rain. My stepfather called it spring cleaning. My mother called it necessary. But when my literature professor asked where my final project materials were, I realized this wasn't about decluttering. It was about making sure I never made it out of this house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me start from the beginning, because the woman standing in that alley digging through garbage for her dreams wasn't always someone who fought back. My name is Evelyn Hartwell, and for most of my 24 years, I'd been what everyone in Willowbrook called the quiet Hartwell girl. Not the pretty one, that was my stepsister Celeste. Not the successful one, that would be my stepbrother Preston, who'd just landed a management position at his father's construction company. I was just Evelyn, the one who worked double shifts at Riverside Community College's library to pay for textbooks, the one who walked 40 minutes each way because I couldn't afford a car, the one who kept her head down and her mouth shut. Our house on Maple Grove Street wasn't much to look at. A 2-story colonial with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged like a tired smile. But it had been home for 6 years, ever since Mom married Gordon Blackthorne when I was 18. Gordon owned Blackthorne Construction, a moderately successful business that kept us comfortable, if not wealthy. He was the kind of man who commanded respect in our small Pennsylvania town, the kind who coached Little League on weekends and donated to the volunteer fire department every Christmas. To the outside world, Gordon was a pillar of the community. To me, he was the man who'd spent 6 years making it clear that I was a temporary inconvenience in his otherwise perfect family picture. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments about my expensive education when I enrolled in college. Remarks about how some people expected others to support their dreams. Questions about when I planned to move out and start my real life. Mom would always smooth things over with her gentle laugh and a change of subject, but I heard the message loud and clear. I was supposed to be grateful for the roof over my head and not ask for anything more. The truth is, I'd never asked for much. While Celeste got a brand new Honda for her 16th birthday and Preston had his college tuition paid in full, I'd worked for everything I had. My first edition book collection was proof of that, each volume carefully selected, saved for, and purchased with money I'd earned shelving returns and helping students with research. These weren't just books to me, they were my ticket to graduate school, my future, my way out. I discovered my passion for Victorian literature during my sophomore year when Professor Margaret Thorne assigned us to read Wuthering Heights. Something about Emily Bronte's raw, unflinching prose spoke to me in a way that nothing ever had. I started collecting first editions not just for their monetary value, but because holding a book printed in 1847 felt like touching history, like connecting with the author across centuries. My collection had grown slowly but steadily. A first edition Jane Eyre from an estate sale in Pittsburgh, an 1860 The Mill on the Floss that I'd found at a used bookstore in Philadelphia, its pages yellow with age but its binding still intact. Each book represented weeks of careful budgeting, skipped meals, and extra hours at the library. They lived on a special shelf in my bedroom, arranged chronologically, each one wrapped in acid-free tissue paper to preserve its condition. Gordon knew how much they meant to me. He'd seen me researching their values online, heard me talking to Mom about using them as collateral for graduate school applications. He'd watched me handle them with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. That's what made what happened next so calculated, so cruel. The morning of March 15th had started like any other. I'd left for my 6 a.m. shift at the library, coffee in a travel mug, backpack heavy with my laptop and research materials for my senior thesis on women's economic independence in Victorian literature. It was my final semester at Riverside Community College, and I was 3 months away from graduating summa cum laude. something no one in my family had ever achieved. My thesis advisor, Professor Thorne, had been encouraging me to apply for graduate programs. "You have real potential, Evelyn," she had said just the week before. "These first editions you've collected show serious commitment to the field. Have you considered using them as part of your application portfolio? Some programs offer substantial scholarships for students who demonstrate this level of dedication." I'd been so excited about the possibility that I'd actually mentioned it to Mom over dinner. Imagine, I'd said, if my book collection could help me get into Columbia or NYU. Gordon had looked up from his meatloaf with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fancy schools cost fancy money, even with scholarships. Mom had nodded along, but something in her eyes had shifted, like a door closing quietly. That should have been my warning.
Instead, I'd spent the morning at the library helping freshmen navigate the periodical database, thinking about my future, about graduate school, about the life I was building for myself, one book at a time. I'd even stopped by the campus bookstore on my way home to pick up a protective sleeve for my newest acquisition, a first edition Middlemarch that had cost me 3 weeks' worth of grocery money but was absolutely perfect for my thesis research. I was humming when I turned onto Maple Grove Street, the protective sleeve tucked under my arm, my mind already on the evening ahead. I planned to photograph my collection for my graduate school applications, maybe even create a small catalog with provenance information for each volume. Professor Thorne had suggested it might strengthen my portfolio. The first thing I noticed was wrong was the dumpster. It wasn't pickup day, and Gordon was particular about putting trash out only on designated days. The second thing I noticed was that the dumpster was full. Unusually full for a household that barely generated enough garbage to fill a single bag each week. But it wasn't until I got closer that I saw the corner of a familiar dust jacket poking out from beneath a bag of kitchen scraps, and my blood turned to ice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I dropped the protective sleeve for Middlemarch right there on the sidewalk and ran to the dumpster. My hands shook as I pushed aside garbage bags, coffee grounds spilling onto my jeans, banana peel sticking to my fingers. But there was no mistaking what I was seeing. My entire collection. Every single book I'd spent 4 years carefully curating, lovingly preserving, desperately saving for. The first edition Jane Eyre with its original cloth binding, now stained with what looked like pasta sauce. My 1860 The Mill on the Floss, its pages warped and swollen from moisture. Wuthering Heights, the book that had started it all, crammed beneath a bag of lawn clippings, its spine cracked in 2 places. "No, no, no!" I whispered, climbing halfway into the dumpster, not caring that Mrs. Patterson from next door was watching from her kitchen window. I pulled out book after book, each one worse than the last. The Middlemarch I'd been so careful to protect was there too, somehow already ruined despite being thrown away just hours ago. How is that even possible? I'd only bought it yesterday. My Sense and Sensibility, the one with the rare publisher's error that made it worth nearly $800, was coffee grounds ground into its cover. The North and South that I'd driven 3 hours to Philadelphia to buy was completely soaked through, its pages already beginning to separate from the binding. I sat back on my heels in the alley, surrounded by my destroyed dreams, and that's when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. "Evelyn? What on earth are you doing in there?" I turned to see my mother walking toward me, still in her work clothes from her job at Willowbrook Family Dental. Her face was a perfect mask of confusion and concern, as if she'd stumbled upon me doing something inexplicably bizarre, rather than desperately trying to salvage the wreckage of my future. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking, "my books, all of my books are in here. Someone threw them away." She frowned, moving closer to peer into the dumpster. "Oh, honey," she said, and I heard something in her tone that made my stomach drop. Not surprise, not outrage, something that sounded almost like relief. You knew, I said, the words falling out before I could stop them. You knew they were in here. Mom's perfectly applied lipstick, Revlon's Rose Romance, the same shade she'd worn every day for 6 years, stretched into what was supposed to be a sympathetic smile. Evelyn, sweetheart, we talked about this. Gordon did some spring cleaning today while you were at work. We've been meaning to declutter the house for months. Spring cleaning? In March, when it was still cold enough to see your breath in the morning. These aren't clutter, I said, holding up the ruined Jane Eyre. These are first edition novels. Some of them are worth hundreds of dollars. I was going to use them for my graduate school applications. Oh, honey. Mom's voice took on that particular tone she used when she thought I was being dramatic, the same tone she'd used when I'd cried about not getting a graduation party or when I'd asked why Celeste got a car, but I didn't. They're just old books. You can get new copies at the library. Just old books. 4 years of work. 4 years of skipping meals and walking miles to save bus fare. 4 years of carefully researching provenance and condition, of learning about paper quality and binding techniques, of building something that was supposed to be my future. Just old books. Mom, these were first editions. The Sense and Sensibility alone was worth $800. I've been planning to use them as collateral for graduate school applications. Professor Thorne said they could help me get scholarships. Something flickered across my mother's face then. Not guilt. I knew what Mom's guilt looked like, and this wasn't it. This was something harder to read. Something that made my hair on the back of my neck stand up. Graduate school? She repeated slowly. Evelyn, we've talked about this. You're 24 years old. Don't you think it's time to start thinking about real life? About getting a job that pays actual money? I have a job. I work at the library.
Part-time, for barely above minimum wage. Mom stepped closer, her voice taking on that coaxing quality she used when she wanted me to agree with something I didn't want to do. Gordon has been so patient, letting you live here while you play around with college. But honey, you can't live in our basement forever. Our basement. As if I'd been some kind of charity case, rather than her daughter who'd been living in the same house since she was 18, helping with grocery costs and household chores, asking for nothing but a place to sleep while I built a future. These books were my ticket out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They were worth enough to help pay for graduate school. I could have gotten into Columbia or NYU or... Those schools aren't for people like us, Evelyn. Mom's voice was gentle but firm, the way she might speak to a child who insisted they could fly if they just flapped their arms hard enough. We're practical people, working people. There's nothing wrong with getting a good job here in Willowbrook, maybe finding a nice young man to settle down with. People like us. As if my 3.9 GPA meant nothing, as if the recommendation letters from 3 different professors were just pieces of paper, as if the last 4 years of my life had been some kind of elaborate game of pretend. I looked down at the Jane Eyre in my hands, its cover now permanently stained with something that smelled like old coffee and regret. This wasn't spring cleaning. This was systematic destruction. This was someone making sure I understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. "Where's Gordon?" I asked. "He's inside watching the game." "Evelyn, please don't make a scene about this. You know how he gets when there's drama in the house." How he gets. As if his comfort was more important than my entire future. As if keeping the peace was worth more than the 4 years I'd spent building something beautiful and meaningful. I stood up slowly, still holding the ruined Jane Eyre, coffee grounds and dirt falling from my clothes. Mom reached out, as if to brush the debris away, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said quietly. For the first time since she'd found me in the alley, Mom looked uncertain. "Evelyn, honey, I know you're upset." "Just don't." I walked past her toward the house, still carrying the destroyed Jane Eyre, leaving the rest of my collection scattered around the dumpster like evidence of a crime.
Behind me, I heard Mom call my name, but I didn't turn around. I had questions that needed answers, and for the first time in my life, I was done accepting whatever explanations were convenient for everyone else. I stood in the doorway of our living room, the ruined Jane Eyre still clutched in my hands, staring at Gordon Blackthorne as he lounged in his recliner. He was watching a baseball game. The Pittsburgh Pirates were down by 3 and eating from a bowl of pretzels balanced on his substantial belly. He looked so completely normal, so utterly unconcerned, that for a moment I wondered if I'd somehow imagined the destruction outside. "Gordon," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the familiar room. He glanced up from the television, his eyes taking in my drit-stained clothes and the book in my hands. Not a flicker of surprise crossed his face. Not even mild curiosity about why his stepdaughter was standing in his living room covered in garbage and holding a damaged antique. "Hey there, Evie," he said, using the nickname I'd always hated. "How was work?" How was work? As if this were any other Tuesday evening, as if my entire future was decomposing in a dumpster 20 feet from where he sat. "My books," I said, holding up the Jane Eyre. "All of my first edition novels are in the dumpster." Gordon reached for another pretzel, crunching it thoughtfully. "Yeah, I meant to mention that. Did some cleaning today. That room was getting pretty cluttered." Cluttered. 23 carefully preserved first edition novels, each one cataloged and stored in protective sleeves on a dedicated bookshelf, constituted clutter in Gordon Blackthorne's world. "Those books are worth thousands of dollars," I said, stepping closer to his chair. "Some of them are irreplaceable. The Sense and Sensibility had a publisher's error that made it extremely rare." "Huh." Gordon's attention had already drifted back to the television, where a commercial for truck insurance was playing at ear-speeding volume. "You'll win some, you lose some." You win some, you lose some. 4 years of my life reduced to a gambling metaphor? Behind me, I heard Mom's footsteps on the hardwood floor. She'd followed me inside, probably worried about what Gordon had just called drama in the house. I could feel her presence hovering near the doorway, ready to mediate, to smooth things over, to find a way to make this all go away without anyone having to acknowledge what had really happened. "Gordon," I said, again, louder this time, "I need you to understand what you threw away. Those books were my ticket to graduate school. I've been collecting them for 4 years. Some of them were worth hundreds of dollars individually." Now Gordon did look at me, really look at me, and something in his expression made my blood run cold. It wasn't confusion or regret or even defensiveness. It was something much worse. Satisfaction. "Hundreds of dollars, huh?" he said slowly. "Funny thing about that, Evie. See, I was talking to Bill Henderson down at the bank last week. You know Bill, coached Preston's baseball team back in high school. And he mentioned something interesting about graduate school applications." I felt Mom tense behind me, but I kept my eyes on Gordon's face.
"Bill's daughter just got into some fancy school up in Boston," Gordon continued, settling back in his recliner like he was about to tell a particularly entertaining story. "Cost him $40,000 just for the first year. $40,000. Can you imagine that?" My hands were shaking now, the damaged book trembling in my grip. "That's why I was applying for scholarships. That's why I needed the books for my portfolio." See, that's where you and I have a fundamental disagreement about priorities, because $40,000, or even $20,000, or even $10,000, that's money that could be put to better use, practical use. "What are you talking about?" Gordon muted the television with the remote, giving me his full attention for the first time since I'd walked into the room. "Celeste is getting married in October. Did you know that?" I blinked, completely thrown by the sudden change of subject. "What?" "Beautiful wedding they're planning. Really beautiful. Church ceremony, reception at the Willowbrook Country Club. About 200 guests. The works." Gordon's smile widened. "Of course, weddings like that cost money. Real money." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Behind me, Mom made a small sound that might have been a protest or might have been agreement. I couldn't tell which. I don't understand what that has to do with my books, I said, though a terrible suspicion was beginning to form in the back of my mind. Well, Evie, here's the thing. Your mother and we've been talking about family priorities, about what's important, about what kind of support different family members need at different times in their lives. Gordon leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the patient tone he probably used with his construction workers when explaining why they couldn't have a raise. Celeste is getting married in October. Did you know that? I still don't see what this has to do with my books being thrown away. But I did see. God help me, I was starting to see exactly what this had to do with everything. Your mother and I have been discussing ways to help with wedding expenses, and it occurred to us that maybe it was time for you to contribute to the family in a more practical way. Contribute how? Well, you've been living here rent-free for 6 years now, eating our food, using our utilities, taking up space that could be put to better use. Gordon's voice remained conversational, almost friendly. We figure it's time you started pulling your weight around here. Mom finally spoke up from behind me. Evelyn, honey, what Gordon's trying to say is that we think it might be better if you focused on getting a full-time job instead of continuing with school. There's a position open at Dr. Morrison's office, a receptionist job, good benefits, steady pay. A receptionist job. After 4 years of college, after maintaining a 3.9 GPA, after being 3 months away from graduating summa cum laude, they wanted me to become a dental receptionist? And the books? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Gordon shrugged. Like I said, spring cleaning, no point in holding on to things that encourage impractical thinking. Impractical thinking? My education, my dreams, my carefully planned future, all of it dismissed as impractical thinking. Besides, and this time his smile was sharp enough to cut glass, you're 24 years old, Evie. Don't you think it's time you grew up and started living in the real world? The real world? As if the world I'd been building for myself one book at a time, one A-plus paper at a time, one recommendation letter at a time wasn't real. As if the only reality that mattered was the one in which I worked at Dr. Morrison's office and helped pay for Celeste's wedding to a man whose father owned car dealerships. I looked down at the Jane Eyre in my hands, at the coffee stains that would never come out, at the warped pages that would never lie flat again. Emily Bronte's words, written over 150 years ago, destroyed in a single afternoon to make room for someone else's priorities. You planned this, I said quietly. Planned what? But Gordon's tone was too casual, too carefully neutral. You knew exactly what those books were worth. You knew I was using them for graduate school applications. You knew, and you destroyed them anyway. Mom stepped forward, her voice taking on that pleading quality that meant she was about to ask me to be reasonable, to be understanding, to be the good daughter who never made trouble. Evelyn, sweetheart, nobody planned anything. We're just trying to help you see that maybe there are better ways to spend your time and energy, more realistic ways. Realistic? Practical? Real world? The words they've been using like weapons for years, designed to make me feel foolish for wanting more than what Willowbrook had to offer. But for the first time, instead of feeling ashamed of my dreams, I felt something entirely else. I felt angry. The anger felt foreign in my chest, hot and sharp, like swallowing broken glass. I'd spent 6 years in this house being the accommodating one, the grateful one, the one who never made waves. But standing there with Jane Eyre's destroyed pages in my hands, listening to Gordon explain how my dreams were impractical while Celeste's wedding was essential, something fundamental shifted inside me. I need to make some phone calls, I said, turning toward the stairs. Phone calls? Mom's voice followed me, tinged with worry. Evelyn, who are you calling? There's no need to involve anyone else in family business. Family business? As if systematically destroying someone's future qualified as a private family matter.
I didn't answer her. I climbed the stairs to my room, the basement room that Gordon had so generously allowed me to occupy, and closed the door behind me. The space felt different now, smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer together while I was at work. My bookshelf stood empty against the far wall, its shelves naked and accusatory. Dust outlines marked where each volume had lived, ghostly rectangles that looked like missing teeth in a smile. I sat on my bed and pulled out my phone, staring at the contact list with shaking fingers. Who do you call when your family destroys your life? What authority exists for this kind of betrayal? First, I called Professor Thorne. Her office phone went straight to voicemail. It was past 6 o'clock on a Tuesday, and she had evening classes to teach. I left a message, my voice steadier than I felt. Professor Thorne, this is Evelyn Hartwell. I need to speak with you as soon as possible about my graduate school applications. There's been an emergency. Please call me back tonight if you can. Next, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Riverside Community College's Student Services Office. They were closed, but their after-hours voicemail system had an option for urgent academic emergencies. I pressed 3 and waited for the beep. This is Evelyn Hartwell, student ID 2847391. I need to speak with someone about my senior thesis and graduate school applications. My research materials have been destroyed, and I need to know what options I have for documentation and replacement materials. Please have someone call me first thing in the morning. But even as I left the message, I knew that administrative support wouldn't be enough. What I really needed was proof that what had been destroyed was valuable. Proof that this wasn't just a college student being dramatic about some old books. I opened my laptop and navigated to my email, searching for the folder labeled Book Collection. Over the past 4 years, I'd been meticulous about documentation. Every purchase had been photographed, researched, and cataloged. Every receipt had been scanned and saved. I even created a spreadsheet tracking the provenance and estimated value of each volume. The numbers, when I pulled them up, were staggering than I had remembered. The collection I'd built was worth $11,847 according to my last appraisal. $11,847, thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. I scrolled through the photographs I'd taken of each book. Careful, well-lit images that showed the condition of the bindings, the quality of the paper, the details that made each volume special, the Sense and Sensibility with its publisher's error, the Wuthering Heights with its original cloth binding intact, the Middlemarch I'd just bought, still in its protective sleeve until this morning. All gone. I clicked on the folder containing my graduate school application materials. Columbia University's English Literature program had been my first choice, and I'd spent months crafting the perfect application. The personal statement where I'd written about my passion for Victorian literature, the academic writing sample analyzing economic themes in George Eliot's work, and the supporting materials section where I'd planned to include photographs and documentation of my first edition collection as evidence of my serious commitment to the field. Professor Thorne had been enthusiastic about this strategy. She told me it shows dedication beyond the classroom. Graduate programs want students who live and breathe their subject matter. Your collection demonstrates that literature isn't just an academic interest for you. It's a passion worth investing in. Worth investing in. Past tense now. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe Professor Thorne had seen my missed call, but the message was from my stepsister Celeste. Heard about the book drama? Mom says you're being ridiculous. They were just taking up space anyway. Can't wait to show you my wedding dress. I stared at the message for a long time. Taking up space. $11,000 worth of literary history. 4 years of careful collecting. The foundation of my graduate school applications. All of it dismissed as clutter,
that was taking up space. Another text came through, this one from Preston. Dad told me what happened. Maybe it's time to focus on real-world stuff. I could get you an interview with the construction company. Good benefits, steady work. Think about it. Real-world stuff. There it was again, that phrase they all used like a magic spell designed to shrink my world down to the size of Willowbrook, Pennsylvania. As if wanting more, dreaming bigger, planning for a future that extended beyond the county line was somehow childish or naive. I deleted both messages without responding and turned back to my laptop. If they wanted to treat this like a business transaction, then I'd treat it like one too. I opened a new document and began typing. Documentation of destroyed property, March 15th, 2024. I worked for 2 hours, compiling every piece of evidence I had, photographs of each book, receipts showing purchase prices, research documenting current market values, screenshots of similar volumes being sold at auction houses, insurance appraisals I'd gotten the year before when I'd briefly considered getting a policy. The document grew to 15 pages of meticulous detail. Every book was listed with its publication date, publisher, condition notes, and estimated value. I included the email exchanges with dealers who had authenticated certain volumes. I added links to auction sites showing comparable sales. By the time I finished, it was past 9 o'clock, and I had created something that looked less like a college student's complaint and more like a legal document. My phone rang as I was proofreading the final page. Professor Thorne's name appeared on the screen. "Evelyn," she said without preamble, "I got your message. What's this about an emergency with your applications?"
I told her everything. The destroyed books, Gordon's dismissive attitude, my family's insistence that graduate school was impractical, the money being redirected towards Celeste's wedding. Professor Thorne listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," she said finally, "what you're describing isn't just unfortunate. It's sabotage." The word hung in the air between us, sharp and final. Sabotage. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not a difference of opinion about priorities. Sabotage. "I've been teaching for 23 years, Professor Thorne continued, and I've seen students face all kinds of obstacles. Financial hardship, family pressure, personal crises. But I've never seen anyone deliberately destroy a student's academic materials. This is something else entirely." "What do I do?" I asked, and for the first time since finding the books in the dumpster, my voice cracked. "My applications are due in 2 weeks. Everything I had planned to submit as supporting materials is gone." "First," Professor Thorne said, "you document everything. Every detail, every conversation, every piece of evidence you can gather. Second, you don't let them convince you that this is normal family behavior. What happened to you today was not normal. And third," Professor Thorne's voice was steel. "Third, you fight back." I woke up at 5 a.m. the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Professor Thorne's words echoed in my mind. Document everything. So that's exactly what I planned to do. The house was still quiet as I crept upstairs to the kitchen, notepad in hand. If this was sabotage, and deep down I knew it was, then it hadn't started yesterday. Yesterday was just the culmination of something that had been building for much longer. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, writing down every conversation I could remember about my education, my books, my future plans. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Last Christmas, when I'd mentioned applying to graduate programs, Gordon had laughed and said, "What's next, a PhD in basket weaving?" When I tried to explain that Victorian literature was a legitimate field of study with career prospects in academia, publishing, and museums, he'd waved me off. "Evie, honey, you're not exactly Harvard material."
In February, when Professor Thorne had encouraged me to apply for a teaching assistantship at University of Pennsylvania, I'd excitedly shared the news at dinner. Mom had smiled that tight smile she wore when she was trying to be supportive but couldn't quite manage it. "That sounds lovely, dear, but wouldn't you be more comfortable staying closer to home?" 3 weeks ago, when I'd shown them the acceptance letter for a summer seminar at the Victorian Studies Association conference in Chicago, a prestigious opportunity that could strengthen my graduate applications, Gordon had frowned at the registration fee. $400 to sit in a room and talk about old books? Seems like a waste of money to me. I ended up declining the seminar. The money had gone instead towards Celeste's engagement party expenses. Now, sitting in the pre-dawn quiet, I could see how each conversation had been designed to diminish my confidence, to make my goals seem unreasonable, to position me as the family member whose dreams were expendable. It had been so gradual, so systematic, that I'd internalized their messaging without even realizing it. By 6 a.m., I had 4 pages of notes detailing what I now recognized as a campaign of psychological manipulation stretching back months. But I needed more than memories. I needed evidence. I started in Gordon's home office, a converted bedroom on the first floor, where he kept his construction business files. The door was never locked. Gordon's confidence in his dominion over the household extended to assuming no one would dare invade his private space. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might explain why destroying my books felt so important to him. What I found was worse than I imagined. In a folder labeled Family Finances, I discovered printouts of bank statements going back 6 months. My name appeared on several pages, highlighted in yellow marker. Gordon had been tracking every penny I spent on books, on school supplies, on anything related to my education. There was a handwritten list in his careful block letters. Evelyn's college expenses, fall 2023. Textbooks, $847. Research materials, $156. First edition book, November, $380. Conference registration, declined, $400. Library fees, $23. Total, $1,806. Below that, in the same handwriting, cost of Celeste's dress alterations, $1,200. Catering deposit shortfall, $800. My blood turned to ice. He'd been calculating how much my education cost and comparing it to Celeste's wedding expenses. Every book I'd bought, every academic investment I had made had been seen as money stolen from his daughter's perfect day. But that wasn't the worst of it. Deeper in the folder, I found a printed email exchange between Gordon and Mom dated 2 weeks ago. The subject line read, "Evelyn's situation, action needed." Gordon's email read, "Margaret, we've talked about this long enough. The girl is 24 and still playing student, while Celeste needs real support for real-life events. I'm handling the book problem this week. Time to redirect her focus toward practical goals. Dr. Morrison confirmed the receptionist position is still available. Benefits start immediately." Mom's response, sent the same day, "I know you're right, but she's worked so hard on those books. Maybe we could sell them instead of just throwing them away. Some of them might be worth something." Gordon's reply made my hands shake. "The point isn't money, it's mindset. If she can sell them, she'll just use the cash for more school nonsense. This needs to be final. Trust me on this." Mom's final message in the chain, "Okay, I'll make sure I'm not here when you do it." I can't watch her face.
I sat back in Gordon's office chair, staring at the printed emails. This hadn't been an impulsive spring cleaning decision. This had been planned, discussed, strategized. They'd known exactly what they were doing, and they'd done it anyway. But there was more. In another folder labeled Celeste Wedding, I found detailed spreadsheets breaking down every expense for the October celebration. The total cost was staggering,
$47,000 for one day. The deposit alone was more than I'd spent on books in 4 years. And at the bottom of the spreadsheet, in a section labeled Funding Sources, I saw my name again. Listed as a household contribution was an estimated $2,400 per month. Money I would contribute through full-time employment at Dr. Morrison's office instead of wasting time with school. They'd already calculated how much money my derailed dreams would generate for Celeste's wedding. I photographed every document with my phone, my hands trembling with rage. Professor Thorne had been right. This was sabotage. But it was more than that. It was a complete financial plan built on the assumption that my future was negotiable, that my education was a luxury they could no longer afford to indulge. As I was photographing the last document, I heard footsteps in the hallway above. Someone was awake. I quickly returned everything to its proper place and slipped out of the office, my phone heavy with evidence. Back in my room, I transferred the photos to my laptop and began organizing them into folders. Financial manipulation, premeditated destruction, planned coercion. Each folder filled with documentation that painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as family concern. At 8 a.m., my phone rang. It was the Student Services office at Riverside. Ms. Hartwell, this is Patricia Chen from Student Academic Support. I received your voicemail about destroyed research materials. Could you come in this morning to discuss your situation? Yes, I said. I'll be there at 9. And, Ms. Hartwell, if what you've described is accurate, you should know that we have resources for students facing family sabotage of their academic goals. Unfortunately, you're not the first student to experience this type of situation. Family sabotage. There was that word again. But this time, instead of shocking me, it felt validating. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being dramatic. What was happening to me was real, documented, and apparently common enough that the college had resources to address it. I dressed carefully that morning. My best jeans, a sweater that made me look older, and my grandmother's pearl earrings. I was no longer Evie, the grateful stepdaughter who never made waves. I was Evelyn Hartwell, a 24-year-old woman with a 3.9 GPA and $11,000 worth of destroyed property. And I was done pretending this was normal. As I walked past the living room on my way out, Gordon called out from his recliner, "Where are you heading so early, Evie?" I paused in the doorway, looking at him with new eyes. Not the man who'd generously given me a home, but the man who'd systematically planned to destroy my future for the sake of his daughter's wedding budget. "School," I said simply. "Might want to think about calling in sick," he said, not looking away from his morning news show. "Dr. Morrison wants to meet you this afternoon about that receptionist position. Time to start focusing on real opportunities." Real opportunities. I looked at this man who thought a dead-end job was a better opportunity than graduate school, who thought his stepdaughter's dreams were worth less than catering deposits and dress alterations. "I'll think about it," I lied. But what I was really thinking about was how satisfying it was going to be to prove him wrong. The meeting with Patricia Chen at Student Academic Support opened my eyes to how far the conspiracy against my education actually reached. Patricia was a woman in her 50s with silver streak hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every story students could tell. But when I showed her the photographs of Gordon's documents, her expression shifted from professional concern to genuine alarm. "Miss Hartwell," she said, studying the image of Gordon's financial calculations on her computer screen, "in 15 years of working with students, I've never seen documentation this explicit. Most family sabotage is subtle. Emotional manipulation, withdrawal of support, social pressure. This is systematic." She pulled up a file on her computer. "We've had 17 cases of family educational sabotage in the past 5 years. Parents who hide college acceptance letters, relatives who refuse to provide tax information for financial aid, families who create crises to prevent students from attending classes. But I've never seen anyone calculate their victims' earning potential as part of funding someone else's lifestyle. Patricia printed out several forms and slid them across her desk. I'm recommending you for Emergency Academic Protection Status. This will allow you to complete your degree even if your family withdraws support, and it creates a paper trail in case you need legal intervention later. Legal intervention. The phrase sent a chill through me, but not an unpleasant one. For the first time since finding my books in the dumpster, I felt like I had allies in positions of authority. But Patricia wasn't finished. She said, "There's something else you should know," hesitating slightly. Dr. Morrison's office called yesterday, asking about your academic standing and graduation timeline. They claimed you'd applied for a position and they needed to verify your availability for immediate full-time employment. My stomach dropped. I never applied for anything at Dr. Morrison's office. That's what I suspected. The timing was too convenient, and the questions they asked were oddly specific. They wanted to know if you had any outstanding academic commitments that might interfere with a Monday through Friday schedule. The trap was bigger than I realized. Gordon hadn't just destroyed my books and pressured me to abandon graduate school. He'd actively been working to secure my compliance by arranging employment that would make continuing my education impossible.
After leaving Patricia's office, I drove to the Willowbrook Public Library, neutral territory where I could think without feeling the weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me. I needed to understand how deep this conspiracy went, and I suspected the answer lay in conversations I hadn't been invited to join. I started with Celeste. My stepsister had always been chatty on social media, posting every detail of her life for her 800-plus Instagram followers. I scrolled back through months of posts looking for clues about the wedding planning timeline and who was involved in the financial decisions. What I found was a pattern of posts that made my blood boil. January 15th. OMG, planning meeting with mom and dad about the dream wedding. So grateful for parents who understand that a girl's wedding day is the most important day of her life. February 3rd. Venue secured. Willowbrook Country Club, here we come. Dad says no expense should be spared for his little princess. February 20th. Dress shopping with mom was amazing. Found V1 and it's perfect. Dad already said yes to the price before I even asked. March 1st. Tyler's parents are contributing $15,000 toward the reception. Our families are so generous and supportive. Some people are just blessed with family who prioritize what really matters. March 10th, just 5 days before my books were destroyed. Final numbers are in and this wedding is going to be perfect. Dad figured out how to make everything work financially. Some family members are finally stepping up to contribute. So grateful for parents who know how to handle family priorities. Some family members are finally stepping up to contribute. The post was accompanied by a photo of Celeste in her wedding dress, arms around Mom and Gordon, all three of them beaming. I wasn't in the picture, but my forced contribution was apparently worth celebrating. I screenshotted every relevant post, then started digging deeper. Celeste had tagged other family members in wedding-related posts, and their comments revealed even more disturbing details. Aunt Linda, Gordon's sister. So smart of Gordon to get Evelyn focused on practical work instead of those expensive hobbies. Real family supports each other when it matters. Cousin Janet. About time that girl started contributing instead of just taking. College is fine, but priorities are priorities. Uncle Mike. Gordon always knows how to handle these situations. Remember when he got Preston focused on construction instead of that art school nonsense? Same principle. I stared at that last comment for a long time. Preston had wanted to go to art school? I remember him drawing constantly in high school, sketching buildings and landscapes with remarkable skill. I assumed he'd chosen construction because he wanted to follow in Gordon's footsteps. But what if he hadn't chosen it at all? I called Preston's number, something I almost never did. We weren't close. The 6-year age gap and different interests had kept us cordial but distant. But suddenly I needed to know if I was the only one whose dreams had been sacrificed for family priorities. Evelyn? Preston sounded surprised to hear from me. Everything okay?
Can we meet somewhere? I need to ask you about something, and I don't want to do it over the phone. We agreed to meet at Murphy's Diner on the edge of town, far enough from Willowbrook's main drag that we wouldn't run into anyone from the family. Murphy was already there when I arrived, looking uncomfortable in a booth by the window. "This is about the book thing, isn't it?" he said before I'd even sat down. "Look, Evelyn, I know you're upset, but Dad's just trying to help you be realistic about—" "Did you want to go to art school?" I interrupted. "What?" "After high school, did you apply to art schools?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his expression was pained. "How did you know about that?" "I didn't. I just saw a comment online and started wondering." I leaned forward. "What happened?" Preston sighed, suddenly looking much older than his 30 years. "I got accepted to Rhode Island School of Design, full scholarship based on my portfolio. I was going to study architectural design, maybe become a real architect instead of just building other people's plans." "What stopped you?" "Dad." Preston's voice was bitter. "He said art school was for people who could afford to fail, and we weren't those people. He said I had a guaranteed job waiting for me at the construction company, guaranteed income, guaranteed future. He said only irresponsible people chose dreams over security. So you stayed." "So I stayed. And you know what? He was right about one thing. I do have guaranteed income. I also have guaranteed misery, guaranteed regret, and guaranteed knowledge that I'll never know what I could have accomplished if I'd been brave enough to try." I felt sick. Preston hadn't chosen construction. He'd been manipulated into it, the same way I was being manipulated into dental reception work. Gordon's pattern of destroying his stepchildren's dreams in favor of practical alternatives went back years. "Preston," I said carefully, "do you know about the wedding funding? About how they're planning to pay for Celeste's reception?" His jaw tightened. "Dad mentioned you might need to start contributing more to household expenses. Said it was time you started pulling your weight." He destroyed my entire book collection. $11,000 worth of first edition novels that I was using for graduate school applications. Then he tried to force me into a job that would make continuing my education impossible. Preston stared at me for a long moment. "Jesus, Evelyn, I knew he could be controlling, but that's systematic sabotage," I finished. "And based on what you just told me, I'm not the first victim." We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the realization that our family wasn't just unsupportive, it was actively destructive toward any family member whose dreams didn't align with Gordon's vision of appropriate ambition. "What are you going to do?" Preston asked finally. I thought about Patricia Chen's advice, about the emergency academic protection status, about the documentation I was building. I thought about Professor Thorne's words, "You fight back." "I'm going to stop letting them convince me that my dreams don't matter," I said. "And Preston, it's not too late for you either. Rhode Island School of Design has continuing education programs. Architecture firms hire people with construction experience all the time." Preston's eyes filled with something I hadn't seen there in years. Hope. But before either of us could plan our escape from Gordon's web of control, we needed to understand just how many other people had been enlisted in keeping us trapped. I spent Thursday morning preparing for war, not the screaming, emotional kind of confrontation I'd always avoided, but the methodical, evidence-based kind that left no room for manipulation or deflection. I printed out every document, organized every photograph, and created a presentation that would make Gordon's financial calculations look amateur by comparison. The folder I assembled was 2 inches thick. Bank statements showing Celeste's wedding expenses, screenshots of social media posts celebrating my forced contribution, Preston's testimony about his own sabotage dreams, which he'd agreed to provide in writing. The printed emails between Gordon and Mom plotting the destruction of my books, Patricia Chen's official documentation of academic sabotage, and most damning of all, a timeline showing how every conversation about my education had been designed to undermine my confidence and redirect my resources towards Celeste's wedding expenses. I called in sick to my library job, the first dishonest thing I'd done in months, but I needed a clear day for what was coming. Then I called Mom at the dental office where she worked as a hygienist. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear the false brightness in her voice. She knew why I was calling. "How are you feeling today? Gordon mentioned you seemed a little upset yesterday." "A little upset? As if discovering your family's systematic plan to destroy your future could be dismissed as a minor mood fluctuation?" "I need you and Gordon to be home tonight at 7 o'clock. We need to have a family meeting." "Oh, honey, tonight's not really good. Gordon has a Rotary Club meeting, and I promised Celeste I'd help her address wedding invitations." "Cancel them," I said, and the steel in my own voice surprised me. "Mom, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. 7 o'clock, both of you. This conversation is happening whether you're there or not, but it would be better for everyone if you participated." There was a long pause. "Evelyn, you're scaring me. What's this about?" "It's about the truth, something this family seems to have forgotten how to tell." I hung up before she could respond, then sent a text to both Celeste and Preston. "Family meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Attendance mandatory. Topic, financial transparency and academic sabotage." Celeste's response came within minutes. "Oh my God, drama much? I have wedding stuff to do." Preston's response was simpler. "I'll be there." By 6:45 p.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table with my folder open, documents arranged in chronological order like pieces of evidence in a courtroom. I had changed into my best dress, navy blue with a white collar, the one I wore to academic conferences, and pulled my hair back into a professional bun. I looked like someone who meant business. Because I did. Gordon came through the door first, still in his work clothes, clearly annoyed at having his evening plans disrupted. "Evelyn, this better be important. I had to cancel drinks with the mayor to be here." "It's important," I said without looking up from my papers. Mom followed a few minutes later, her face tight with anxiety. She'd stopped at home to change out of her scrubs, and the careful way she was moving suggested she was expecting an explosion. Behind her came Celeste, dramatically sighing and checking her phone every few seconds to make it clear how inconvenienced she was by this interruption. Preston arrived last, and I was grateful to see that he'd brought a folder of his own. We'd talked again that afternoon, and he'd spent the day gathering his own evidence of Gordon's manipulations. The rejection letter from Rhode Island School of Design that he'd kept hidden for 10 years, pay stubs showing how little he was earning compared to what an architect might make, and even some of his old artwork that Gordon had convinced him to abandon. "All right," Gordon said, settling into his usual chair at the head of the table. "What's this emergency meeting about?" I opened my folder and pulled out the first document, Gordon's handwritten calculations comparing my education expenses to Celeste's wedding costs. "It's about this," I said, sliding the paper across the table. Gordon glanced at it, and I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed quickly by defensive anger. "Where did you get that?" "From your office, along with these." I laid out the printed emails one by one, watching as Mom's face went progressively paler with each revelation. "You went through my private papers?" Gordon's voice was rising. "That's a violation of privacy?" I interrupted. "You want to talk about violations of privacy? Let's talk about how Dr. Morrison's office called my college to discuss my employment availability for a job I never applied for." Celeste looked up from her phone for the first time. "What job?" "The receptionist position your father arranged for me, designed to make it impossible for me to continue my education and force me to contribute to your wedding expenses." "That's not," Mom started, but I cut her off.
"Mom, I have your emails. I have the timeline. I have documentation from the college confirming that this is systematic academic sabotage." I pulled out Patricia Chen's official letter. "Would you like me to read the part where they explain that what you've done to me is considered educational abuse?" The word abuse hit the room like a physical blow. Celeste's phone slipped from her hands. Preston shifted in his chair, nodding grimly. Gordon's face flushed red. "Now you listen here," Gordon said, standing up and pointing a finger at me. "Everything I've done has been for the good of this family. You've been living here rent-free for 6 years, taking advantage of our generosity while pursuing some fantasy about becoming a college professor. It's time you learned about real responsibility." "Real responsibility," I repeated.
Like destroying $11,000 worth of my property to fund someone else's party? Those weren't property, Gordon snapped. They were old books taking up space in my house. Your house. I pulled out another document. The property deed I'd looked up at the county courthouse that afternoon. Actually, Gordon, this house is in Mom's name, from her first marriage. You have no legal ownership of this property. The silence that followed was deafening. Gordon sat down heavily, his face cycling through several different emotions. Furthermore, I continued, the books you destroyed were legally my property, purchased with my own money, documented and appraised for insurance purposes. What you did constitutes destruction of property worth more than $5,000, which, in Pennsylvania, is a felony. Evelyn, you can't be serious about legal action. We're family. Are we? I asked. Because families don't systematically sabotage each other's futures for wedding money. Families don't forge employment applications to trap each other in dead-end jobs. And families definitely don't calculate how much money they can make by destroying someone's dreams. I turned to Preston. Tell them about Rhode Island School of Design. Preston cleared his throat, pulled out his own folder, and told the story I'd heard at the diner. But hearing it in front of the family, seeing Gordon's face as Preston described the scholarship he'd been manipulated into declining, made the cruelty even starker. So you see, I said when Preston finished, this isn't about one destroyed book collection or one pressured career change. This is about a pattern of behavior designed to keep certain family members trapped in situations that benefit others. Celeste finally spoke, her voice small and confused. But Dad said you wanted to help with the wedding. He said you realized grad school was impractical and you wanted to contribute to something meaningful. I never said any of those things, I replied. What I said was that I was applying to graduate programs and hoping to use my book collection as part of my application portfolio. What your father heard was an opportunity to redirect my resources toward your wedding budget. I pulled out the final document, a detailed breakdown of exactly how much my forced employment would contribute to the wedding fund over the next 6 months. This, I said, is what your father really thinks of my future, not as something worth supporting, but as something worth sacrificing for your benefit. Gordon was staring at the table, his jaw working silently. Mom was crying quietly into a tissue. Celeste looked like she was going to be sick. Preston leaned forward. Dad, I need to know, was any of it real? When you said I wasn't college material, when you said I should be grateful for guaranteed work, did you believe that, or was it just convenient? Gordon looked up at his son, his biological son, the one he should have wanted to succeed, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely ashamed. I thought that keeping you close was the same as keeping you safe. Safe from what? Preston asked. Success? Independence? Self-respect? Gordon didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all knew that his version of safety looked exactly like control, and his version of family looked exactly like ownership. I closed my folder and stood up. Here's what's going to happen. I'm finishing my degree, I'm applying to graduate school, and I'm doing it without any further interference from this family. And if we don't agree to that? Gordon asked, his voice a mixture of defeat and defiance. Then I file a police report for destruction of property, a complaint with the Better Business Bureau about your business practices, and a civil suit for educational sabotage. And I do it all very publicly, so that everyone in Willowbrook knows exactly what kind of man Gordon Blackthorne really is. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Gordon Blackthorne, pillar of the community, coach of Little League, respected businessman, exposed as someone who destroys his family members' futures for money. Your choice, I said, walking toward the stairs. But either way, I'm done being the family member whose dreams don't matter. The first call came at 7:23 a.m. on Friday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize with a 215 area code, Philadelphia. Ms. Hartwell, this is Dean Elizabeth Carmichael from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I received some very concerning information about your situation from Professor Margaret Thorne. Do you have a few minutes to speak?
I nearly dropped my coffee mug. Penn had been on my list of potential graduate programs, but I hadn't expected any contact from them for weeks. Yes, of course. Professor Thorne forwarded me the documentation you provided about the destruction of your academic materials. I've been in higher education for 25 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Dean Carmichael's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear genuine concern underneath. I'm calling because we want to make sure this incident doesn't derail your graduate school plans. Over the next 15 minutes, Dean Carmichael explained that Penn had an emergency protocol for students whose academic progress was being sabotaged by family members. It was apparently more common than I'd realized. Talented students whose families saw education as a threat to traditional expectations or financial security. We've established an emergency application track for students in your situation, she said. If you can get us your transcripts, writing samples, and professor recommendations by next Friday, we'll have an admissions decision for you within 2 weeks. We're also prepared to offer immediate financial aid, including emergency housing assistance if you need to relocate quickly. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table. I don't understand. I haven't even applied to your program yet. Professor Thorne has been singing your praises for months. She's been showing your work to colleagues, including myself. When she called yesterday to explain what happened to your collection, several of us immediately agreed that we couldn't let this kind of sabotage succeed. Consider this an expedited invitation to apply. After hanging up with Dean Carmichael, I sat in stunned silence. In less than a week, I had gone from having my future destroyed to having one of the country's top graduate programs actively recruiting me for emergency admission. The phone rang again. This time it was Patricia Chen from Riverside's Student Services. Evelyn, I have updates for you. First, Dr. Morrison's office called this morning to withdraw their job offer. Apparently, they received a very stern call from our legal department about attempting to coerce students into abandoning their education. I almost laughed. Gordon's carefully arranged trap had backfired spectacularly. Second, Patricia continued, I've been in touch with the Pennsylvania Department of Education about your case. What your stepfather did, systematically destroying academic materials to prevent educational advancement, qualifies as educational interference. It's a form of domestic abuse that's been increasingly recognized by family courts. Educational interference? The terms kept getting more official, more serious. What had felt like a family conflict was being recognized by institutions as something much more sinister. There's one more thing, Patricia said. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer called. Professor Thorne mentioned your case to a colleague who freelances for their education section. They're working on a case about family sabotage of higher education, and they'd like to interview you. You don't have to agree, but the visibility might prevent this from happening to other students. A newspaper article about my family, about Gordon's manipulation and my mother's complicity? The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. That afternoon, I drove to campus for what I thought would be a routine meeting with Professor Thorne. Instead, I found her office full of people I'd never met. Other professors, graduate students, even the department chair. Evelyn, Professor Thorne said, standing as I entered, I hope you don't mind the crowd. Word has gotten out about your situation, and frankly, people are outraged. Dr. Harrison, the department chair, was a silver-haired woman in her 60s who looked like she could intimidate a senator. Miss Hartwell, I've been teaching for 35 years, and I've seen all kinds of obstacles students face, but I've never seen such calculated academic sabotage from within a student's own family. She gestured to a stack of papers on Professor Thorne's desk. Those are letters of recommendation. 7 different faculty members have written letters supporting your graduate applications. We've also compiled a replacement research bibliography for your thesis, and Dr. Martinez here has offered to lend you first edition volumes from her personal collection for your application portfolio. Dr. Martinez, a specialist in Victorian women's literature, smiled warmly. I have duplicates of several titles that were in your destroyed collection. They're yours to use, and if you get into graduate school, they're yours to keep. I felt tears welling up, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of rage or despair. They were tears of gratitude for a kind of support I'd never experienced from my own family. There's more, said James, a graduate student I'd worked with on a research project. Some of us have been talking, and we want to start a fund to help students whose families sabotage their education. We're calling it the Academic Freedom Defense Fund. Your situation inspired it, but you won't be the last student who needs this kind of support. Professor Thorne handed me a check. This is from the English Department's Emergency Student Fund. It should cover your application fees for graduate school and help replace some of your research materials. I stared at the check, $2,500, and realized that these people, who had known me for less than 2 years, were investing more in my future than my family had in 6 years of living under the same roof. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Harrison pulled out her phone. She said, I took the liberty of calling my colleague, Dr. Patricia Williams, at Columbia. She's the director of their Victorian Studies program. When I explained your situation and showed her samples of your work, she asked me to give you this message directly. Dr. Harrison cleared her throat and read from her notes. Tell Miss Hartwell that Columbia University categorically rejects the premise that economic necessity should require anyone to abandon intellectual pursuits. We have emergency funding specifically for students whose families attempt to sabotage their education, and we would consider it an honor to help her complete her academic goals. Columbia, the program I dreamed about, but never dared to believe I could actually attend. She wants you to call her directly, Dr. Harrison continued. Here's her personal number. As I walked back to my car that afternoon, my head was spinning with possibility. In the span of 3 hours, I'd gone from being a student whose dreams had been destroyed to being actively recruited by multiple graduate programs, supported by an entire academic department, and positioned to become a case study for protecting other students from family sabotage. My phone buzzed with a text from Gordon. We need to talk. Family dinner tonight. Be there. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. No, we're done talking. My lawyer will contact you about restitution for the destroyed property. I didn't have a lawyer yet, but I would by Monday morning. Patricia Chen had given me the name of an attorney who specialized in educational abuse cases, and Dean Carmichael had mentioned that Penn's legal department was willing to provide support for students pursuing civil claims against family members who sabotaged their education. Another text came through, this one from Mom. Please don't do this to our family. We can work things out privately. I almost laughed. Now they wanted to work things out privately. After destroying my property, manipulating my employment prospects, and attempting to force me into a life I'd never chosen, they suddenly discovered the value of family communication. But it was too late for private solutions. This had stopped being a family matter the moment they made it about money instead of love. Control instead of support. I typed back, you made this public when you decided my dreams were worth less than Celeste's wedding decorations. Deal with the consequences. Then I blocked both numbers and drove home to start packing. I had graduate school applications to complete, interviews to schedule, and a future to build. And for the first time in my life, I was doing it with the support of people who valued my mind more than my compliance. 2 years later, I stood in the graduate student lounge at Columbia University, holding a first edition copy of Villette that I'd just purchased with money from my teaching assistantship. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was rebuilding my collection one book at a time, but this time each purchase represented freedom rather than sacrifice. The newspaper article about family educational sabotage had run 6 months after the confrontation, with my story as the centerpiece. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of students contacted the reporter with similar experiences. Academic institutions began developing formal protocols for educational abuse cases, and the Academic Freedom Defense Fund had grown into a national organization with chapters at over 50 universities. But more importantly, lives had been changed. Preston had been one of the first beneficiaries of the new awareness. The article had quoted him extensively about his lost architectural dreams, and within a week, he'd received calls from 3 different firms offering apprenticeships designed for people with construction experience who wanted to transition into design work. He was now in his 2nd year of a part-time architecture program, working days and studying nights, finally pursuing the career Gordon had convinced him to abandon. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm not good enough," he'd told me during our monthly coffee meetings. 10 years of believing I'd missed my chance, and it turns out I was just getting started. The transformation in our relationship had been one of the unexpected gifts of fighting back. Preston and I had discovered that we were allies who'd never known they were in the same war. We talked regularly now, supporting each other through the complicated process of rebuilding identities that had been shaped by someone else's limitations. Even more surprising was the letter I'd received from Celeste 3 months ago. She'd postponed her wedding, not canceled, but postponed after realizing the entire financial structure was built on other people's sacrificed dreams. "I can't start a marriage on money that came from destroying your future," she'd written. "Tyler and I are saving up for our own wedding, something we can pay for ourselves. It's going to be smaller, simpler, but it'll be ours. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what Dad was really doing to all of us." Gordon himself had become a pariah in Willowbrook after the newspaper article. His construction business had lost several major contracts when potential clients learned about his treatment of his stepchildren. The mayor had quietly asked him to step down from the Rotary Club leadership position. Even his sister Linda had distanced herself from him after realizing that the family priorities she'd supported involved systematic psychological abuse. But perhaps the most significant change had been in my mother. The woman who'd spent 6 years enabling Gordon's control had finally seen the full scope of what she'd allowed to happen. She'd started therapy, something she'd never considered before, and slowly began reaching out to repair our relationship. "I told myself I was keeping the peace," she'd said during one of our careful phone conversations, "but I was really just choosing the easy path, even when it meant watching my daughter's dreams get destroyed. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know that I see it now. I see what I did, and I'm ashamed." Forgiveness was still a work in progress. Trust would take even longer. But for the first time in years, my mother was talking to me like an adult whose opinions mattered, whose feelings were valid, whose dreams deserved protection rather than sacrifice.
The academic world had embraced me completely. My thesis on economic independence and intellectual freedom in Victorian literature had won the Departmental Award for Excellence, and I'd been invited to present my research at conferences across the country. The destroyed book collection had become part of my scholarly narrative, a personal understanding of how economic control is used to limit intellectual freedom, themes that resonated powerfully in Victorian women's literature. Professor Thorne, who had become not just my mentor but a true friend, often joked that Gordon had inadvertently given me the perfect research background for my chosen field. "You understand Dorothea Brooks's frustration in Middlemarch in a way that most scholars can only theorize about," she'd said. "You've lived the experience of having your intellectual ambitions dismissed as impractical by people who claimed to have your best interests at heart." My apartment near Columbia was small, but entirely mine. The walls were lined with bookshelves, not just first editions this time, but a working library that reflected my evolving interests. I had modern translations alongside antique volumes, feminist criticism next to original Victorian texts, books about educational psychology shelved with literary theory. In the center of the main bookshelf, I'd placed a small frame containing the first page of the destroyed Jane Eyre, the only piece I'd managed to save from the dumpster. It was stained and torn, but still readable. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. Below it, I'd written in careful script,
but there's always the possibility of fighting back. The frame sat next to a photo from my graduate school graduation where I stood between Professor Thorne and Dean Carmichael, all three of us grinning like we just won a war. In a way, we had. My phone buzzed with a text from James, who was now the director of the Academic Freedom Defense Fund. Another case in Ohio. Parents destroyed a student's art portfolio to force her into business school. Can you talk to her this week? I typed back, of course, send me her information. This had become part of my mission, talking to students whose families were sabotaging their education, helping them understand that they weren't crazy, that what was happening to them wasn't normal, and that there were people and institutions ready to support their fight for academic freedom. Each conversation reminded me of how far I'd come from the woman who'd stood in a dumpster trying to save destroyed books while her family watched from windows. That woman believed that love meant accepting whatever treatment your family decided you deserved. She thought that fighting back would make her selfish, ungrateful, dramatic. This woman, the one typing support messages to a stranger in Ohio, knew better. Love doesn't ask you to shrink your dreams to fit someone else's budget. Family doesn't mean sacrificing your future for other people's comfort. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable the people who are hurting you. I closed my laptop and walked to the window of my apartment, looking out at the Columbia campus where I was building the life Gordon had tried to prevent me from having. Tomorrow I had a meeting with my dissertation advisor about my PhD proposal. Next week I was interviewing for a summer research fellowship in London. Next month I was presenting my paper on Victorian women's economic narratives at a conference in Chicago. None of it would have happened if I'd accepted that my dreams were impractical, that my education was selfish, and that my future was worth less than someone else's wedding decorations. I thought about the destroyed books sometimes, but without the crushing sadness that had overwhelmed me that first night. Those books had been symbols of my dreams, but they weren't the dreams themselves. The dreams lived in my mind, in my work, in my determination to never again let anyone convince me that what I wanted didn't matter. And now I was helping other people discover the same truth, that your dreams are worth fighting for, that education is never impractical, and that the people who try to limit your potential are revealing their own fears, not your limitations. I picked up the framed page from Jane Eyre and read the familiar words again. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day, but there's always the possibility of fighting back. And sometimes that's exactly how you find your way home to yourself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.